Okay, so probably a bit more outlining is important to do first. So this talk does two things. I hope it does them both reasonably well. The first is exploring different reasons that we might have at a theoretical level for caring about freedom of speech, and places where they might clash, and places where they might not necessarily overlap, and therefore which could be useful in free speech debates as providing wedge arguments to accept one reason or another. And the second thing is providing a number of classic examples of freedom of speech cases. One note in terms of the example set, almost all the examples are from the UK and the US, a couple from European Union law. This is because, in part, I prepped this for World Schools Debate Academy taking place in the European Union, for which I semi-apologise, but you know, can't necessarily rewrite every workshop every time afresh. So, why do we care about freedom of speech? Why, in other words, bother to have this talk? So, I mean, one is just it's a core liberal value. If we think about the values of Western liberal democracies, probably that's ranked relatively high. That's considered something that's constitutive of something being a Western liberal democracy, a liberal state. The second is, I think it's actually quite an interesting showcase for the clash between consequentialist considerations and deontological considerations. I won't explain exactly what that means now if you aren't aware, because there's a separate slide that does that. But in terms of clashes between different ways of thinking about morality and the intersection of morality and political philosophy, freedom of speech cases are quite interesting cases for that. And finally, it's a contested value in a number of contemporary debates, many of which we'll be looking at. So it is something that's worth having some understanding of at the back of your mind for debates that might come up. So consequentialism versus deontology. So consequentialism, in the broadest sense, are moral theories or schemes that attempt to ground our understanding of moral terms like good or bad or right or wrong in terms of actions tending towards some outcome which is a notion of the good. So normally, in most cases, this would be utilitarianism. This would be an understanding of the good couched in terms of utility, happiness. We're trying to promote happiness, or we're trying to decrease the amount of suffering, and these kind of things. But it could be other things, right? You could have a consequentialism about, I mean, you could have a consequentialism about rights, which would be a very strange one. You could have a consequentialism that tries to balance a number of different goods. You could have a consequentialism that tries to maximise the extent to which people satisfy their preferences, regardless of, strictly speaking, the number of utility units someone is producing. Maybe you're sceptical about utility units. So we normally contrast, within moral theory, consequentialism with deontology. As in, like, that tends to be the term used for the thing that isn't consequentialism. It's a very ill-defined term, in part because there are a number of different moral schemes that are all labelled under that rubric, which are radically different in terms of what they talk about. But broadly speaking, it is moral theories or schemes which are concerned with the intrinsic rightness or wrongness of things, usually actions. So the intrinsic wrongness or rightness of an action. As has been widely commented upon on such luminary forums as debate shitposting, contemporary debating is weirdly impact obsessed and has a strong lean towards consequentialism, therefore as a result. I think one of the historical reasons of this is just because it's very easy to incorporate ideas from things like economics and other kind of practically focused disciplines if you do so within a consequentialist framework. And also it's very easy to do the kind of weigh up between different cases if you think about them in terms of practical impact. So in terms of, say, number of people made happy versus number of people made sad. It's easier to do that weigh up than, the extent to which autonomy is being violated. So I think this is why there's a degree of inbuilt push towards consequentialism. But there are attempts to try and counteract that. You'll see in a lot of judge briefings in the near past and near future, people explicitly making a point to say that debating shouldn't presuppose a consequentialist framework for moral thinking. Classical liberties, though, are often conceived by definition in deontological terms. So they'll often be couched in terms of rights or something else, which doesn't necessarily immediately evoke this kind of consequentialist way of thinking about things, of just saying, well, we're purely defining things in terms of outcomes. So three broad justifications of freedom freedom of speech, which we'll unpack throughout the course of the workshop. So the first, we might value freedom of speech because it promotes the search for truth. This is an instrumental way of thinking about things, insofar as if something is instrumental, it's because we value it for its tendency to promote something else that we value intrinsically. So skipping slightly, or stealing an idea from here, another useful thing to have in, as a stock argument in a lot of debates is the fact to some extent our value of democracy is similarly instrumental. Right? We value democracy insofar as we do because it promotes certain other things. It might promote stability, it might promote good policy making, it might be the case that it helps people feel engaged or feel committed to their country, these kind of things. It's not clear that we value democracy as an end in itself, and so therefore if other systems are able to deliver upon the same thing, and this would be the justification maybe for explicitly anti-democratic states like China, might be still acceptable governments because they're promoting certain of the things that democracy is able to promote as well. So a second reason we might care about this, freedom of speech, is that it's required for democracy to function in some way. So it's something that is part and parcel of what it means for a state to be democratic. And if it's not democratic, it doesn't necessarily have freedom of speech. If it doesn't have freedom of speech, it's not necessarily democratic. I think in order to ground this a bit more in something that seems intuitive, presumably what makes a state a democracy is not merely voting every 5 years or something. It's just merely voting is maybe not enough for something to be a democracy. If you don't give people information about what options they have to vote on, or what other options might exist that they're not able to vote on, or alternatively just having substantive discussion about what the state does out with the electoral cycle, probably would say that state is not really democratic, or at least is not living up to a democratic ideal. And then finally, you could say that freedom of speech is an extension of the autonomy of the individual. So it's valuable not because just of its function in democracy, and it's not merely instrumental in terms of trying to promote truth, but it's something that, if individuals don't have then a certain fundamental right of them, which is, I guess, intrinsic to them, and maybe prior to the state, something we were talking about yesterday and we're going to unpack again today, is being missed. So if we just think about the first of those, speech is instrumental for seeking truth, we're returning to Mill. So these slides don't necessarily suppose that we did do the Western philosophy thing yesterday, but obviously we did, so it won't dwell on this too much. So I say surprisingly, obviously, because it seems a bit weird to find Mill defending a liberal right, given he is best known as being a utilitarian, but we've explored why that's the case yesterday. He has reasons to try and balance the two, which are unique to him. So if we just break this down, there's three reasons that Mill gives us. So the first is we are fallible. It might be the case that we don't necessarily know what the right answer is. Maybe the minority opinion is the correct one. But second, even though that's not true, it might be the case that we only have partial truth, and the minority opinion, by some form of dialectic process, is going to help us realize this. And the third, possibly the most interesting, is even if those minority opinions are false, through the collision of adverse opinions, we can recognize other errors, or we can get better at defending the truth. There's a risk that otherwise we will hold on to dogma unless it is fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed. So the idea that we need to have the challenge that's provided to us of adverse opinions, of opinions that we disagree with, and opinions that we have reason to believe are actually false, in order to be able to make sense of what it means for an opinion even to be true, and in order to keep ideas that we think are true as vivid in our mind, be able to defend them, be able to know why it is that we think they're true. One potential weakness. We can actually deny the premise of instrumentability, at least in a number of cases. So it does seem there are some cases of speech that we already know is not necessarily going to be valuable to us, for some reason misspelled as valuable. So hate speech, not necessarily clear the truth-seeking value of this. Obviously you might say, well, that's an anomalous case, because hate speech doesn't necessarily aim at the expression of a statement about the world, it doesn't necessarily aim at truth-speaking. But this might be a reason that said, if the reason that we value freedom of speech was the instrumentality of trying to promote truth, maybe that means it's acceptable to ban hate speech. Art we think is worthless, not necessarily clear why art, which is not necessarily very good art, or very moral art, is going to aid us in terms of the search for truth, so maybe we could get away with banning that. speech or political movements we think of as dangerous. We're thinking about a couple of examples of that later on. Someone studying race and IQ for the millionth time. I have a kind of fetishistic interest in this because it was part of my partial double octo case that was unsuccessful. It was just like, I just don't see the value of having someone have, yet another flawed study of race and IQ studies. I'm not sure why. If we know there's a problem with the methodology they're using, why we need to allow that to be published, we need to allow that to be explored. But as a justification for absolute speech rights, therefore, it would seem to be a bit shaky, because there's all these things that we can think of where we can deny the idea there is instrumentality to be had, there is an instrumentality to be had, so maybe this instrumental justification won't get us very far in terms of providing a sound basis for a very robust defense of freedom of speech. The second problem is that no justification actually assumes a very high bar in terms of how rational people are. So there's a risk that individuals might not be particularly rational with how they actually relate to the information that's released. There might be kind of group irrationality. So it's not the case that people necessarily read retractions. There might be confirmation bias. I think a decent example of this is a lot of people who are opposed to gay adoption, or another example might be people that are concerned about the MMR vaccine, for example, potentially causing autism in children, do so on the basis of, in both cases, a single study, which has subsequently been called into question in terms of its methodology by subsequent research, but nonetheless, they still respond to it, right? So they still bother to repeat the claims based on it, they still promulgate these ideas. So it might well be the case that we should be concerned about the extent to which if we get some of these things in the discourse, people won't necessarily respond in the most rational, optimal way. They won't necessarily respond to changes in the ideas in the way that we should. If like, certain of these claims are shown to be falsified, they might not recognise the falsifiability. So this might provide some paternalistic justification for violating freedom of speech in those cases. So minority speech being valued. There's a saying, I guess, a phrase that you probably heard before, which is free speech doesn't extend to shouting fire in a crowded theatre. Kind of the minimum standard for when we are definitely justified in violating freedom of speech. What is less widely known is the origin of this claim, which comes from a US case called Schenck versus the United States. So Schenck was a group of Jewish pacifists, or Schenck was a member of a group of Jewish pacifists who were opposing the US entry into World War I, who were publishing pamphlets in Yiddish, a language that most people can actually read. And nonetheless, the Supreme Court decided that there was sufficient risk to the national interest in fighting the war that they would not allow him to publish these leaflets. And I think they sent him to prison, didn't they? Maybe? Doesn't say. So they decided they did, okay. So they sent him to prison for publishing these pamphlets, despite the First Amendment saying Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech over the press or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So that seems to imply that you probably would want someone who was protesting a war that wasn't necessarily an essential war, like the US wasn't being invaded, and even in that case you might still think it would be reasonable for people to oppose a conflict in a language most people didn't speak. And the justification includes the idea that we don't necessarily have an absolute protection in terms of the fact that it doesn't cover people shouting fire in a crowded theatre, and yet there seems to be a case where you probably would want someone being able to provide you information about the fire that's taking place around you. So the view was that allowing him to do this constitutes a clear and present danger, will bring about substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. The substantive evil being the risk that the US wouldn't necessarily enter into World War I. And in the same month, the court also upheld a prison sentence of many times presidential candidate Eugene Debs for praising draft dodgers. So governments frequently appeal to stability or safety in order to justify censure or criticism. Not clear that this is actually a defensible justification, at least in a number of cases where they actually use it. Does freedom of speech exist prior to the state? So this kind of application of the idea of prior necessities to the state that we were discussing a lot yesterday. So the issue of priority is, I think, important for deontological rights. So some examples that we thought about yesterday: property rights, parental rights, and speech seems to be an obvious candidate. So speech is a plausible candidate at the point where if we have any notion of the state of nature, plausibly the individual has freedom of speech within the state of nature. Right? The individual has the ability to express their views before joining together in the state, and therefore you would think that it does exist prior to the state. But that being the case, some form of speech are definitely artificial. You might ask the question, should the state facilitate speech? Should it be the case that the state is going around trying to produce speech in various ways? Suppose that we do accept some instrumental justification of speech. So we're trying to use freedom of speech in order to promote certain ends, in order to try and achieve a certain discovery process in terms of truth. Maybe that means that we don't necessarily have an obligation just to censor, but we actively have to facilitate minority expression, which challenges mainstream views. For example, funding minority art. We might need to subsidise for certain expressions to be possible in order to cause us to discover new truths, or alternatively to aid the collision of truth with error. So maybe we even fund things that are not necessarily true in order to create the capacity to have that kind of challenging process. We think this challenge is very valuable.
There was a motion, does it fall into this, about funding EU satirical?
Probably not. I mean, I think
anti-right.
But I think the idea there was this is going to be a way to undermine the far right.
Yeah.
I think if anything, the freedom of speech argument in that debate possibly falls on opposition. That you say it is the far right are to some extent entitled to their views and entitled not to have their resources used against them for the purpose of satire of their views.
Which resources?
Well, I mean, presumably the EU's getting money from somewhere, right?
From EU.
Well, yeah, but at some point someone pays tax, right?
Okay.
Does actually the facilitation, state facilitation, means that that it actually inhibits the freedom of speech for, say, minority? If you facilitate this freedom of speech for minority,
Yeah, like the yesterday's
it's
model.
definitely is an inhibition of a freedom of speech from someone else.
I
Or can we avoid that?
think that's the next slide. But yes,
All right.
especially if you think that freedom of speech is to some extent zero-sum, then yes, any promotion of minority speech would presumably cause a decrease of majority speech. And you can also do that indirectly by means of thinking about the actual resource distribution issues at place here, right? So if I'm taking, I mean, I'm not saying necessarily money is speech, although I think that's on a subsequent slide. But if I'm taking your money away and using it to fund speech that you don't like, you're not going to enjoy that very much, right?
Yeah.
And that's going to limit your capacity to do other things that are to some extent expressive.
I see now.
By definition, this is likely to be unpopular speech. It's a minority, right? It's not the majority view. And it does raise certain insoluble problems, right? What speech should you fund, right? If you're going to be in the business of funding art for the purpose of just like funding art, what arts do you fund? Should everyone be a potential artist? Should we fund one project from everyone? Should we have some process to discover what art should we be funding? Who runs that process? This is in some ways the classic justification for academic tenure. So the ability to protect academics from being fired because of the views they express is in part justified on the basis that we're trying to promote these things by protecting academics from majority opinions, to give them the capacity, to give them the platform to express unpopular minority opinions in a lot of cases. So there are trade-offs, however, as well. So this is kind of what we're alluding to, that to some extent facilitation might, in certain circumstances implicitly, but in other cases explicitly, involve active censorship. So if we think about the right to reply in German newspapers, or equal time in UK broadcast rules during elections. So the former says if you were talked about in a newspaper, you have a right to have your own opinion expressed in the same forum with the same plausible level of publicity with which the attack was made. And in UK election cycles, they say that there needs to be equal representation between at least the major political parties during the election cycle and some representation of the minor political parties. So it can't just be the BBC only covers the Labour Party or only covers the Conservative Party. But in order to do that, in order to promote the minority speech, we have to presumably to some extent be censoring the majority speech, right? There are cases where there's a clear zero-sum coverage of one opinion in the German newspapers trades off against coverage of other opinions. And presumably there are test cases there. So The Guardian gave Putin a column in Comment is Free, the kind of website version of The Guardian, which is free for everyone. And Putin talked about his great love of democracy and his long-term commitment to building a democratic Russia and how much he'd achieved along those lines. All rather interesting stuff. So if we switch tracks slightly to the democracy justification, as we said, there might be another question you might want to ask, which is democracy itself an absolute good, or is it an instrumental good? I guess the absolute justification would be something like saying power must be distributed, and given that's the case, it must be distributed over a broadly participatory process. So we have to have state empowered, but given that's the case, it flows from concerns we might have about how that power is used, that there needs to be a participatory process deciding how that power is going to be used and who it's going to be used by, versus an instrumental justification that just says, well, actually, we're really concerned about these other things. So we're concerned about stability, or we're concerned about the fact that democracy might be a useful way to discover certain things, such as, are people familiar with the wisdom of crowds effect? So it doesn't really work for everything, but it's sometimes a useful idea to use to explain why democracy might be useful for making decisions. So you're familiar with, I don't know if you have town fairs, but do you ever have like those beads in the jar or something, or like how many beads are in the jar, write your name down on this form with your guess. Do people have that here?
Like a lottery?
Kind of like a lottery, but you're guessing how many like sweets are in a jar, or beads are in a jar, or something like that.
No, we don't.
It's a kind of standard feature of English county fairs that you do this kind of thing. It's like guessing the weight of a pig. And it just so happens that over time, the average of the guesses will tend in the direction of the right answer. Because a large number of people who are semi-informed, guessing intelligently with a view to trying to get the right answer, will over time triangulate towards the correct answer. So this is called the wisdom of crowds effect. If you have a large number of people en masse who are similarly, but probably balanced in terms of the flaws of their perspectives, the aggregate of their guesses tends towards the correct answer. So this might be an explanation as to why the kind of decisions we get through the democratic process might be valuable in some ways. So if we value democracy then, whether absolutely or instrumentally, it might mean that we have to ensure that we have equal protection. It might mean that we need to ensure that minority opinions aren't crowded out the process, that we have some capacity to express that. And this might generate obligations to censor majoritarian speech in order to facilitate that access in terms of the things that we were just discussing, things like equal time and so on. Marcuse has the suggestion that what we need to do is censor the regressive right in order to undermine the powerful and promote discourse. So you can actually recouch this in ideological terms. So because we know the right wing is likely to be on the side of the powerful, therefore we should censor the right in favour of the left, and that's entirely neutral because what we're really doing is we're increasing the capacity for a democracy to challenge the powerful by doing that. That's presumably a slightly more controversial idea than this. This tends towards neutrality, or could be conceived in neutral terms. This is departing from that neutrality in the interest of saying, well, neutrality is really just playing into the hands of the powerful. There's an intersection with debates over political participation of minority parties, very obviously. So, does democracy function under conditions of persistent dominance, or of just, say, a dual-party system, where it's either going to be one party, or it's going to be another party? Not really clear that it does. Not clear that a party being able to win an election simply because of discontent with the current government is really a democratic system, or alternatively, if you think of, say, the South African kind of situation where you have one party that always wins every time, it's not clear that that's actually functioning as a democracy in terms of the democracy having the capacity to actually change what policies are represented.
Is it what they base their rating on? Like you have democratic, semi-democratic, and hybrid states. You know this map?
I would think that the party system would factor in there, but my understanding is it probably incorporates a lot more things like freedom of the press and freedom of political expression. So yeah, it's probably more civil liberties based than empirical issues to do with the actual and like how good the voting system is or how reliable the voting system is than stuff to do with the party political setting. But if it doesn't, it certainly should. But I think there's a sensible argument that says you need something like, well, so let's play the argument now. There's a sensible argument that says you need something like the Dutch or Danish kind of political setup or Israeli political setup, whereby you have a large number of smaller parties and they all come together by virtue of coalitions. There are at least two reasons why you might think that's less democratic or flawed in terms of how democratic it is. The first is, in most of these settings, it tends to be the case that there is a party which can more or less guarantee perpetual representation in the government. So that kind of happens in the Danish and Dutch setups with the centrist parties, because obviously they're able to work with the centre-right and centre-left, and so therefore they tend to be returned to the government. Probably the Israeli example is the most pernicious there, because the ultra-Orthodox parties, that's to say the parties that represent the interests of ultra-Orthodox Jews, they run on a platform which is largely politically neutral. They just say they're going to protect certain rights that the ultra-Orthodox have. Like, the obvious one would be exemption from conscription. And because they're able to work with any government, they tend to always be in the government, and they only make this one policy demand, and therefore that policy becomes permanent, even if, say, only 4% of the population care about that. Now, you should ask yourself the question, is that democratic or is that incredibly undemocratic, right? On the one hand, a policy that only 4% of the population care about being fixed because that party is almost always part of the government doesn't seem very democratic. On the other hand, well, 4% of the people care about that issue more than anything else in the world. So maybe that is democratic, and maybe if they didn't have the capacity to be able to express their views that way, then they would be able to achieve the thing that they want from democracy, which is to not have to fight for the IDF. So, our last broad justification of freedom of speech, autonomy-based interpretation. So autonomy might be a value that we care about either as a justification for certain state policies. So we discussed this in the Western Political Philosophy one with reference to say how it is that we go about justifying forcing people to attend schools or to wear seatbelts. I guess seatbelts is a bit of a trivial case, but nonetheless, we are forcing people to do things because we think that by doing that, it aids in their autonomy, it aids in their ability to make certain choices. And you might think speech is either something that aids in the creation of autonomy, so the ability to live in a state in which multiple views of different kinds are expressed, aids in your capacity to make certain choices, to be able to decide certain things, to be able to, I guess, discover new ways of living. Or alternatively, you might think that it's grounded actively in autonomy. You don't really have personal freedom if you live in a world which doesn't necessarily, which doesn't have the capacity to be able to express those things. So, I mean, if we just consider these on a kind of almost spectrum, from the most instrumental to the least, we say speech has good effects, helps us discover the truth, very instrumental, versus speech helps our democracy function and remain as one. That's somewhat instrumental, but instrumental grounded in a kind of core function of democracy. So there's a degree of, help me if you're using this term, telos involved. There's a degree of directionality to why we care about it. Do people have a right to express criticism regardless of whether they will convince people? Depending on how you feel about that question, probably alters whether you think that you are interested in speech because it has certain consequences that you think are beneficial, or you think that it's intrinsically valuable in its own right.
So can I ask about this? What was this idea? Well, it came out of the safe space and trigger warnings development. The idea was, for example, if you have a speaker that you feel can convince people in something you deem as wrong, you would not ban that speaker, but you will invite someone to speak against that speaker so that you would have opposing views to weigh. Does it come into the last one, regardless of?
I mean, insofar as I think it might be an alternative way to realise this, the right of people to express views, regardless of how you feel about those views or the effects of those views.
But it's kind of
Yeah, I guess so.
controlling the effects of the views. Is it maybe?
It is, but I think the justification you would give is it's preferable to alternatives that involve active censorship.
And also,
Also,
yes.
I don't want to talk about too much about that because
Okay.
a subsequent section of the lecture is specifically on the
Oh, okay.
associated with this.
just for a second, on the last one, if you don't mind, a right to be exposed to criticism, maybe, well, it sounds a bit weird to me, maybe a right to not to be exposed to criticism, actually.
Well, so if one of the things you care about is the idea that speech is necessary to really have autonomy, then that would mean that you don't necessarily just have the right to express your opinion,
Yeah.
but there's some obligation on the state to allow you to be exposed to criticisms of your opinions so you can then make meaningful choices about them. So I think this is maybe most intuitive in
That's
thinking
interesting way
about.
to put it.
Yeah, like this is the extreme non-instrumental end, right?
Yeah.
This is the far out there alternative version. So this would be something like saying the state should expose you to criticism
Yeah, exactly.
of your religious views, because otherwise there's a risk that you might get trapped into those views.
But
Yeah,
is
that's
that a
more like-
right or an obligation?
Is it a right or an obligation?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Because
Sounds more like
if-
something you should do, not like something you would want to do.
But it's forcing you to go to school, right? That's the thought. So it's forcing you to go to school, maybe for purely economic reasons, right? Maybe it's just trying to train you up to be an accountant, right? But if it's not, if it's forcing you to go to school in order to enable you to make choices about your life and how you would want to live, then maybe that would also extend to saying there's an obligation on the state not to censor speech in order to enable there to be ideas out there in the world and society so that you can make more decisions, more informed decisions about yourself. And that, I acknowledge that's the weird, but that's the point, right? It's like weakest to weirdest. So we're just thinking about a number of practical cases now. So the same kind of ideas but played through a number of case lenses or practical lenses. So first, thinking about political speech, corporate speech. So as you probably are aware, but if not, you should be aware, in 2010, the US changed its rules about campaign finance because of a case called Citizens United versus the FEC, or alternatively versus Hillary Clinton, because Citizens United published Hillary Clinton, the Truth, I think it was, and they did so using lots and lots of corporate money, and they said, the FEC said this violates, so Federal Election Commission said this violates electoral spending rules, and the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well no, actually, if corporations are people, my friends. So corporations are, at least viewed in one way, collections of individuals that have come together for a project, right? So the classic, slightly rustic view of a corporation is there's a bunch of people that have come together to build a bridge, and they've pooled all their resources together to build that bridge. Now, whatever is required in order to achieve the bridge building process, that happens in the corporation, but it happens in a way that's similar to an individual, right? So that corporation will then, say, lobby politicians in much the same way an eccentric rich individual trying to build a bridge would do that. So there's a sensible basis of thought. I'm not saying I necessarily believe in corporate personhood, but I'm just saying it is a defensible idea that says corporations viewed in that way should have at least some of the political capacities of people because they are aggregates of people. And that is at least established law in the US, that corporations are to some extent people. People have First Amendment protections. If corporations are people, then people have First Amendment protections, then corporations must also have First Amendment protections. And this is understood as them having the ability to speak, but they can only speak using money, because they can't speak using tongues, because they don't have tongues. So therefore, says the justification, corporations have to speak by means of money, so any restriction on the money that corporations can speak with is terribly unfair. This leads us into a very strange place where I think obviously unlimited corporate spending, given the nature of contemporary corporations, isn't a bunch of people trying to build a bridge somewhere rural. It tends to be massive international banks, these kind of things, arguably very unbalancing for politics. So this is why a lot of people are very unhappy with the decision. Although it's always worth remembering for the purposes of debates about money in politics and speech in politics, especially if they're taking place in a US context, that there are cases where that can be beneficial for the left as well. So the pink dollar is the term often given to the bundled money from the LGBT community that helped Barack Obama get elected, or at the very least win in the primaries over Hillary Clinton. And similarly, funding that comes from unions, so bundled money on the left wing of the political spectrum. Always worth remembering whenever you're in a debate about money in politics, because people just assume that money is always going to be in the right wing. It's not necessarily clear that's always the case. Also worth bearing in mind that it's not clear that money can necessarily buy votes. Money buys you advertising. It doesn't necessarily buy you votes directly. So there is some degree of participation, and so there's an argument that says, well, money is just really giving more information to people. It's not necessarily like bribing them. You can't bribe people. What you can do is give them more information. This weighed against this idea that comes from a guy called Lawrence Lessig, who's a constitutional writer in the US, who says the current status quo has effectively two primaries. One is a political primary, and the other is the money primary. And you need to win the money primary in order to be able to progress. You need to show that you're capable of raising enough money to be a viable candidate, otherwise no one's going to be willing to support you, and so on. So, freedom of speech within politics. This is a free speech zone. There was a ruling that said that that right of position to assemble and express grievances could be realised by means of creating a special area for people to express things. So this is the free speech zone at the Democratic National Convention in 2004. The convention is somewhere over there, very far away from the free speech zone. But if you had, say, problems with something like the Iraq War, you could go to the free speech zone and you could speak as much as you want. Without,
speaking corner in
Like Park.
yeah,
And what
without.
happens to people who
Well,
speak that?
well, but at least that is no one believes they're going to influence politicians in Hyde Park, right? Whereas in theory, if I go to the DNC in order to protest, I'm hoping to see some Democratic politicians I can persuade, but I'm not going to see them in the free speech zone, right? So the free speech zones functioned in order to keep protesters away from politicians. The US Supreme Court ruled that it was acceptable to provide free speech zones as an alternative venue at which to voice dissent. You don't actually have to engage in it. By contrast, there are people who intend to engage in the kind of speech which the First Amendment was presumably designed to intend. So if the First Amendment had a point to it, you would think presumably it was there in order to allow people to be able to express views to politicians. So explicit versus, sorry, another error in the thing, versus implicit bans on government criticism. So some states, such as Turkey, have explicit rules against speech critical of the government or the founders of the state. This should be relatively familiar. Even though that's the case, it's also possible to do this similarly but indirectly. So Singapore doesn't have any strict rules. This was far less topical when I wrote these slides than it is now. Those of you that know many Singaporeans will have seen a lot of stuff to do with Sheng Wu Li, who's a former debater that's happening at the moment.
What happened to him?
Do you want the whole story? Or? So Lee Kuan Yew left a house that he said should be demolished in order that it shouldn't become a cult artifact of him. His son, who's now the Prime Minister, has decided not to demolish it. The rest of the family is saying that they should. Sheng Wu mentioned that maybe the government of Singapore might occasionally use libel laws to protect itself from criticism on Facebook in a private post, and he's now being sued by the Attorney General for contempt of court because he suggested that sometimes the government would sue people to censor their speech. So in other words, he's being sued in an attempt to censor him for suggesting that the government sometimes sues people
To censor this.
to censor them. So Make of that what you will. Seems somewhat ironic, but I'm sure it's less funny if you're actually involved in it. So in Singapore, the government will often use very liberal libel laws to protect themselves from unfavourable coverage, arguably, allegedly, who knows. In most states, governments can abuse the rules of licensing, funding and access in order to limit unfavourable coverage. So in other words, you say to journalists, look, you won't be able to get access to politicians in the future if it's the case that you print this story right now, don't want you to print this story, and it's quite likely that they won't. There's sometimes a justification of this given in terms of public safety and security, as we mentioned previously, so stability is traded against political criticism on the grounds that any criticism of the government by definition has the risk of destabilising it. Although you might think that maybe a degree of instability, a degree of criticism of the government is actually desirable. A couple of notes on free speech cases in the European Union that are at least worth knowing about. So the European Convention of Human Rights provides what they call a margin of appreciation for the various rights that they allow for. And the margin of appreciation means that different states could apply the same freedoms in different ways and still be consistent with the convention. So I think the extreme-ish example of this is it was ruled that Austria was able to ban a play that was critical of the Catholic Church, and that wasn't a violation of freedom of religion. It's a case called Lingens versus Austria. But at the same time, Turkey is entitled to prohibit headscarves in public buildings, and that is consistent with freedom of religion. I believe the government has now reversed that now, because obviously the current government is, I don't think it's controversial to say, is at least likely Islamist. But obviously, these two ideas represent a fairly wide range of what is covered by freedom of religion and freedom of expression.
But is
of religion.
Turkey a member of the convention?
It is, yeah.
It's not even, like the talks have been halted, right?
You're thinking of the European Union.
Oh, okay.
The European Convention of Human Rights is a different body
Everyone who signed
that's
it.
regulated by the
Yes,
European Court of Human Rights. So, curious enough, Russia is a member. I don't believe Belarus
No,
is.
it's not.
But Russia is, and Turkey is, and a number of other states that are not members of the European Union are nonetheless members of the European Court of Human Rights and signatories to the European Convention of Human Rights.
So if you sign it, you have to respect all the human rights that are mentioned there, but if you don't, you don't have to.
Tricky. If you sign it, it is possible for your citizens to take the government to court in order to sue the government for violation of their rights. These court processes take a lot of time, a lot of money, and given the margin of appreciation given to countries, they're quite often unsuccessful even when they might think that they would be successful. And governments can obviously, to some extent, ignore the ruling. So, for example, there was a ruling a while back that I think this is an ECHR case rather than an ECJ case, I could be wrong, that the UK needed to allow prisoners to vote because this is required by the right to democracy. And the UK said no. And the ECHR said, well, we're going to fine you then. And the UK said, fine, we'll pay the fine. And then the ECHR said, come on guys, just let one prisoner vote. Like, just find some group of prisoners you think are relatively peaceable, they're only going to be in prison for a year or something, let them vote, and we'll say you've done your job, and the UK government refused for reasons that pass understanding. It's occasionally emotion that gets sat wrongly, because I genuinely think there is no possible, the only opposition to it you can mount is just say, oh, prisoners, but a lot of these people will return to
It's not
society.
like a state court where they have police that can come, to implement the decision.
Yeah.
Like no one comes to bring the punishment to.
No, all you can do is fine. So they can offer fines, and if the state decides to pay those fines,
But this is about the Fundamental Convention of Human Rights, or not?
the European Convention of Human Rights.
European,
There's also the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but that with
That's
the
just
So that's
declaration.
what-
with the possible caveat that the ICJ might occasionally use that as a guideline principle. As far as I know, that's unenforced. That's literally just a standard that people try to meet. So one case that's always controversial is Holocaust denial bans. So the 17 countries, including Israel, Austria, Germany and France, in which Holocaust denial is banned. I think one thing we should ask is this valuable speech? Should we inquire into the motives of people that are engaged in this? Does the ability to express it invite credibility? So in other words, if you have people going around saying, I don't know the Holocaust happened, or I don't know it happened in the same volume it did, maybe that allows more people to believe those things. But then we should think about the practical effects of the ban. Does it invite paranoia on the part of those who might be inclined to believe it if they think that the government is, say, too afraid to hear the truth? There's an interesting test case for this that's worth knowing in terms of debates about the far right and capacity of speech, which is the Lipstadt trial. There was a few years back a film version of it as well. So Deborah Lipstadt wrote a book saying David Irving, who was a British historian, was a Holocaust denier, and rather foolishly he decided to sue her for libel, took her to court, and the court found against him, which is to say they had a hearing of evidence, and they submitted evidence that he was a Holocaust denier, and the court said, yep, he's a Holocaust denier, alright. And so he's officially been declared to be a Holocaust denier, and to some extent it undermined him. But that wouldn't be possible in a country in which it was illegal. We wouldn't be able to have the same open court process in which the evidence for both sides are looked at, and the court makes a ruling as to whose evidence is better than the other. Something that's only possible in a country in which the denial itself is legal, but you can still have court processes about, for example, whether or not you libel someone by calling them a Holocaust denier. So the next thing I want to discuss is protections from speech. So one classic case of this is the Nazis in a town called Skokie in Illinois. So they wanted to do a march in a largely Jewish neighborhood. And they were taken to court and they were defended by the American Civil Liberties Union on the grounds this is a meaningful form of expression. They need to express their National Socialism, I guess, in a Jewish neighborhood. And the court did actually find in favour of them and said if they were denied the ability to march, to express themselves, this would be a violation of the First Amendment. Presumably we need to consider a couple of things in this and similar cases, whether the motive is actually speech or is intimidation. And if the motive is intimidation, should that speech actually be protected? Which is to say, do we have an obligation, as much as we might have obligations to promote and allow speech, to protect people from speech which is designed to injure them or harm them or intimidate them, and by intimidating maybe reduce their capacity to engage in speech. So hate speech versus hate crime. So hate crimes aggravated by the presence of a prejudicial element, prejudicial motive. So the hate speech itself would be an expression of that prejudicial element. So if we value speech for its capacity to enhance autonomy and democratic participation, this is maybe speech that's not likely to promote that particularly. If we value speech for its instrumental value, it's likely to be a limited instrumental value. So maybe these are things where it's very easy for us to justify banning. I think the concerns are likely to be, one, over-criminalisation. So if we ban some things as hate speech, it might be the case we end up banning other things as hate speech. In the next couple of slides we'll look at examples where laws which are designed to protect minorities from religious discrimination have been argued to have a chilling effect on the ability to criticise religions in a way that's actually meaningful, and the kind of creeping justification that goes with that. So the risk that the justification for one act of censorship ends up justifying another form of censorship they might think is more problematic. Just in terms of notable backfires of the attempt to limit speech in terms of the far right. So during what's normally called the Troubles, so that's the inter-communal violence in Northern Ireland, the BBC banned Sinn Féin leaders speaking on the TV. They were still reporting on them, they were still saying what they said, but what they got was voice actors coming in to do voiceovers so that they would be less persuasive. And this kind of backfired. A lot of people felt this was silly or unfair, and to some extent it aided the plausibility of the Sinn Féin cause, that they were able to say, look, the British government is being unreasonable to us, it's not giving us open and free representation within the media because they're afraid of what we have to say. The fact that they were willing to dub them over with silly voices or alternative voices presumably adds to some extent to that justification. Nick Griffin, who for a time was the leader of the British National Party, was allowed to speak on Question Time. So Question Time is a BBC discussion show where they get politicians and sometimes members of the media and celebrities on to discuss politics of the day. And at the time, the British National Party had representation in the European Parliament. They'd won a couple of seats in the European Parliament elections, and so they said the BBC rules about equal representation means we should get to go in an episode of Question Time because, you know, we've been elected, we're representing people, so we should get to take part in BBC political discussions. They decided that he should. This is a controversial case, which is useful to keep up as an example. This is an example that can be run from either side of the debate about political extremism and representation, insofar as if you are in favour of the idea of giving people a platform in which to expose their views, a lot of people thought his appearance was very ridiculous. He said very strange things that were instantly called out by other panellists, that were made fun of by the audience. It wasn't necessarily a very great performance on his part. However, nonetheless, membership of the British National Party did go up as a result of his appearance. So there was lots of people that joined the British National Party after seeing him on TV, despite the fact he was being made fun of, and despite the fact he seemed like a bit of an idiot. So the example can work on either side if you know the empirical facts of the case. And similarly, just in terms of feeding a kind of paranoia or a narrative that says they're afraid of what I have to say. Geert Wilders, who's political party, the Partij voor Vrijheid, the Freedom Party, PVV, was trying to shop this anti-Islam film called Fitna to various countries, and some of those countries, including the US and the UK, denied him the right to go there. And he said, well, this just means they're afraid of what I have to say, they're not in favour of freedom of speech. And arguably, it helped add to his profile, it helped him seem like he was an international figure, dealing with, you know, the repression of the left wing, afraid of what he had to say. So one question from a more kind of meta level, when we're thinking about harms and hate speech, is how harmful speech actually is. In keeping with what we said earlier, it's not entirely clear that Mill's harm principle really applies here at the point where it tends to be talking about physical harm and doesn't necessarily deal so well with mental harm, or what you might call the harms of people reacting to expressions. The legal philosopher Joel Feinberg offers alternatively the offence principle. So you weigh the harm of the offence against the value of the speech. So if the speech is not very valuable, then the fact that it harms people while being expressed is something you should take into account, whereas if it's very valuable speech, so you really want to allow it to happen, maybe even if some people are offended by it, you should still allow it. I think there's obvious problems with this, which is one, what if the marginal value to the individual is very great, but to overall society is small? So in other words, it's not clear how well we're able to assess value of speech, but even insofar as we are, if we're able to get some kind of numerical value, it's quite plausible there's going to be cases where the value to the person engaging in speech is very high, even if the value to overall society is very low. And this trades off against the earlier question of whether or not we value speech for its capacity in terms of autonomy, or we value it for something more instrumental, like the general concern in terms of getting useful ideas into the discourse, that kind of thing. Similarly, you might think of objections to things like pornography on the grounds that maybe there might be problematic effects in terms of how people think, or the kind of the thoughts that people have, the expectations people have about women versus the fact that people want to be able to access it. Protections of minorities. So particularly blasphemy speech has been a controversial case in Western Europe for some time now, in part because it keeps on being on the agenda, because every so often there are incidents like the Charlie Hebdo case, or the Gillen's Poston, the Danish newspaper that had a cartoon contest, send in the pictures of Muhammad. And so when there are counter-protests against this, lots of people suggest that maybe we want to have a ban on, say, depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, or people call for those kind of bans. One concern is this actually gives extra legal status to those who shout the loudest. So not all branches of Islam actually prohibit depictions of Muhammad. Some, arguably, like the Druze, actively use depictions of Muhammad as part of their expression of worship. So maybe if we ban Muhammad, we'd actually have the effect of harming these other people. Another example, sometimes things get misinterpreted. So there's a famous piece of abstract art that's always, I don't really know much about art, so I have a very finite number of examples of art, and this is one that I tend to use a lot. So this guy produced a crucifix suspended in what appeared to be a vat of urine, and called it Piss Christ, and it was perceived as being blasphemous, but it was actually intended as a highly religious criticism of the church. So lots of people were calling for it to be banned as being blasphemy, but that wasn't necessarily the aim of it. Dangers of overreach and of censorship and criticism in terms of religion. So we've kind of already discussed fitna. I forgot when I discussed that, so I added it to an slide. Two other examples though. So there's a UK playwright in, I think she was in Manchester, she might be in Birmingham, who wrote a play that was critical of misogyny within the UK Sikh population. And the Sikh community opposed the play. They said it was blasphemous against Sikhism, and they were able to put enough pressure on the playhouse that it actually not performed. And so the concern is that the government goes along with some of these cases where they say, well, they're trying to protect the minority, they're trying to protect this religious group in the interests of protecting a vulnerable minority. They might end up undermining the minority within the minority. So people who are, say, within that minority group who are trying to criticize the way that minority group does things, always a concern that should be had if you're trying to censor certain groups. And similarly, like, it's possible that sometimes these groups go wrong. So I think we mentioned this very briefly yesterday, didn't we? So there's an organization in the US which tended to historically just monitor the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations called the Southern Poverty Law Center, who have a group of hate groups. And their list is sometimes used by other organizations as being authoritative. Recently, however, they've included Quillam, which is an anti-extremist Muslim organization in the UK. So these two guys.
Oh, really? It's the guy who wrote the book.
Yeah. If you'd like to say anything, you might like.
Isn't he a Muslim reformer?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, did I get you right? He included the Quillam in his hate groups list.
Yes.
Ah,
So Quillam is an organisation founded by Ed Hussein and Manj Nawaz, who are trying to combat extremism within the Muslim community. They're both former Islamists themselves. And they were added to the Southern Poverty Law Centre's hate group list, and they were like, why? And the Southern Poverty Law Centre said, well, you know, they occasionally go to events with, share platforms with Muslim extremists. And Manj Nawaz's excuse for this is, yes, we go to debates with them and debate with them because the whole point is we're trying to discuss extremism with them and convince them not to be extremists.
Quarrel with SPLC now, actually.
With
I'm subscribed to his Twitter, actually, Magic Nawaz, and he's having some sort of a quarrel with SPLC at the moment.
Well, this is the point.
But he's the founder of the SPLC.
No, he's the founder of Quillam.
Ah, I see.
His quarrel with the Southern Poverty Law Centre
I misunderstood. So
they-
SPLC included him on an extremist list, and Quillam is his group. Okay, it makes sense now. Okay, thank you.
So he's not very happy about that.
Of course, I was
And
confused.
I mean, there's a practical implication there as well, because it harms his ability to get funding, to get representation if he's officially defined as a hate group, or semi-officially. I'm not sure if you say SPLC is official. Okay, so I think this is the last thing that we're going to discuss. So this is the university speech, protection from speech in the form of thinking about safe spacing and platforming. So another, I guess, manifestation of the idea of protecting people from hate speech or protecting people in terms of the emotional stress they might feel if they have speech they don't necessarily like, is found in the current debate that's taking place mainly in America, but also to a lesser extent elsewhere, about safe spaces and no platforming. So trigger warnings are, I imagine everyone knows, but a warning that says here's what the content of this lecture or whatever this topic might involve. There are arguments in favour of this, so it might aid in some students participating in classes if they know what the content is going to be, they can avoid content that's going to be particularly distressing to them. It might aid in some minorities feeling more secure at universities. But on the other hand, it might cause a chilling effect in certain subjects. So I think maybe one of the most controversial cases is some law faculties are considering dropping discussion of sexual assault laws. The idea being that they can't actually run those lectures because people won't attend because of trigger warnings and so on. So they're just going to remove sexual assault from the curriculum entirely. But obviously, you kind of want lawyers to know about sexual assault, right? You probably want them to have a full coverage of the criminal legal system. Similarly, there's arguments that says trigger warnings silence particularly religious students by virtue of the fact that it suggests that some concerns are more valid than other concerns. So it might well be the case that some people have concerns about content which aren't covered by the conventions that govern trigger warnings, and their emotional distress is being deprioritised relative to other people's emotional distress. So at base here, based on a kind of claim made by some of the Yale student protesters, is maybe two competing conceptions of what universities are. Whether they are homes to a certain extent, so the Yale student protesters were like, this is supposed to be a home, versus the idea that they're a space for radical thought, or a space for the expression of
Home in
ideas.
the meaning of a safe space, right?
Yes.
I think that's it.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, the Yale student protest, for those who don't know, originally came about because someone sent an email around saying maybe people should think about the costumes they're going to wear at Halloween and maybe think about whether their costumes are going to offend anyone. And a guy's wife, he was the dean of a hall of residence, and his wife sent out an email saying, you know what, I think this is quite sad. I don't think they should do this. I don't feel they should feel a need to do this, because I think they should be treated like adults and be able to wear whatever they want. And everything went crazy, and everyone said, this is completely outrageous. This is students trying to destroy freedom of speech on campus, versus this is people actively encouraging racism and trying to destroy minorities or whatever. Which, as that summary might suggest, I think both sides blowing it out of proportion. But I think one of the reasons for that is it does trade off against certain rival conceptions of what universities are supposed to be. So, do universities have responsibility to engage in civic education as well? This idea that they're trying to, encourage people to, I guess, have more progressive views, or are they supposed to be a space to experiment with radical ideas? Does this mean, in practice, expressing ideas which selectively harm minorities? And if so, does that maybe stifle the extent to which people express their views evenly and fairly? So I'm concerned that maybe if you did have a radical anti-censorship view, maybe that would mean that people from minority groups would be less likely to go to universities, less likely to speak up in class, and so on. No platforming is actually a term that originally comes from the UK National Union of Students. As it says actually in brackets, the real policy, despite the name having taken off, is incredibly toothless. The real policy just says that the NUS or NUS affiliated organisations are obliged to organise counter-protests or facilitate. I don't think they even have to organise, they have to facilitate counter-protests for speakers that are on the platform. But it's now associated with movements to prohibit controversial speakers from campuses. So the UK examples would be people like Nick Griffin, or Islam for UK, an organisation trying to install Sharia law in the UK. Hasn't really been very successful so far. But there's a risk they might expand in its usage. So this would be radical feminists who, by virtue of the radical feminism, are anti-trans. They say that transsexuals aren't real women or men in disguise, these kind of things. And in its weirdest manifestation, they tried to ban the UK Universities Minister from visiting, I can't remember which UK university it was, but a UK university, on the grounds that given tuition fees, some people would find his presence there very distressing. And so they wouldn't hear what he had to say on the thing they were distressed about. One question, I'm not sure whether this is the one that's done with follow on, but you might ask the question whether or not the freedom of speech extends to a private environment, whether you have a right to demand an audience in these cases. There's obviously a US equivalent now, which is mass student protests to prevent certain speakers speaking at various campuses, which includes people like on the right wing, so Milan and Indianapolis, probably the most controversial, and Coulter, Ben Shapiro, right-wing speakers associated perhaps unfairly with the alt-right, in some cases perhaps unfairly, but also is extended to more alternative, less controversial cases, like presumably the hardest to defend one being Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State under George W. Bush. I thought it was Brandeis, but anyway, she wasn't allowed to speak at Rutgers University because of student protests. And similarly, Charles Murray, who's a libertarian commentator on international relations, was assaulted by protesters at Middlebury College in Vermont. It's not clear this is actually effective. Many of them, in lots of cases, found alternative venues to speak very close to the college, so the audience was the same, and they gained a lot of attention from doing so. So obviously, Milo Yiannopoulos basically made a career out of doing so to some extent, and has fed criticism of the campus left. The extent to which the campus left is maybe not necessarily seen as serving the interest that should in terms of university. Whereas by contrast, Bernie Sanders during the early phases of his career sought out an audience at Liberty University. So Liberty University was founded by, I think, Jerry Falwell. Certainly a right-wing evangelical person within the US religious environment, and is very much a private university built around that ethos of being like right-wing and evangelical. But nonetheless, Bernie Sanders went there and spoke up about abortion and got a relatively positive response from the student body there in so doing. Do you want to talk about freedom of speech online? Okay, so freedom of speech online. So a lot of the question here comes from whether or not you're treating the university environment as being a arena in which you're trying to express things that are, I guess, socially unexpressible. So whether or not you conceive of the internet as having the capacity to be a radical free speech environment, or to some extent it's an extension of the normal world environment, which presumably would make you concerned about the risks of anonymity. And obviously there are harms in terms of what people can do with anonymity, not just people committing crimes and so on, but one standard example tends to be what about thin-inspiration websites, so websites where people, for example, try and goad each other into being more and more anorexic and seeing how far they can push that, or things like cyberbullying and people being able to use anonymity to attack people without accountability. There's also a general concern about the way in which people relate to speech differently online than they would in public, in part because of the kind of mass nature of a lot of online speech. So there's a lot of cases discussed in John Watson's book, You've Been Publicly Shamed, but probably the most interesting one is there was a PR executive by the name of Justin Sacco who was getting on a plane to South Africa, and he tweeted, "Going to South Africa, hope I don't get AIDS." And by the time she landed, she was a public hate figure. She'd lost her job, and basically her life was ruined by virtue of the fact that people on Twitter didn't really see the funny side of it. And as she defended herself subsequently, it was not necessarily the greatest joke in the world, but it was consistent with other jokes that she said, and she obviously wasn't racist and didn't intend it to be racist. But nonetheless, once the ball gets rolling in terms of these kind of mass shaming events, a lot of the John Watson stuff is just talking about the degree of anxious. Okay, so questions to think about. Reasonable evidence, the current move to restrict speech doesn't necessarily enhance autonomy with respect to freedom of thought. Debatable whether it has positive effects. It may benefit autonomy in the broadest sense, right? So it might well be the case that there's a degree to which access to, say, university environments and so on is enhanced for some groups by universities seeming like they're friendly environments to them, but maybe this is traded off against the fact that some people may be alienated from the same spaces as a result of it. Are speech restrictions which go beyond the risk of imminent injury to the speaker legitimate? Can you be harmed by an idea? Can you be harmed by the absence of an idea? This kind of idea we were talking about earlier about saying you might actually have an interest in having ideas in the discourse which are critical to certain things that are important to you, but which nonetheless you would benefit from being challenged. Whether or not that challenge would change your mind, you can still benefit from the exposure to that criticism, kind of reaffirming the things you actually believe.
Yeah, so out of these three ways of defending free speech. Which ones are the most useful when you're actually running a right to free speech case?
Well, it kind of depends on the context, right?
So you use all, but it seems like intrinsic free speech, that it is an extension of your bodily autonomy, may not be the most persuasive.
Well, so are you trying for a robust version of freedom of speech, or a more expansive definition of freedom of speech? In which case you probably want to, in other words, say this thing the government's defending is a illegitimate infringement of freedom of speech because freedom of speech needs to include da 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 da, then you have a more expansive definition. If, on the other hand, you may be on the side of a restriction, you can say, well, the real reason we care about freedom of speech is instrumental. The real reason we care about freedom of speech is trying to achieve these things, and we've achieved these things, so it doesn't really matter if we ban hate speech, for example, because there's no instrumental benefit to be banned by that. So it's kind of like saying, would you want to always define democracy in terms of it being an instrumental good, or would you want to define democracy in terms of being an intrinsic good? It depends on what side of the debate
So
you're
how
on.
do you weigh that as a judge? So one side says it's an extension of bodily autonomy, the other one says, oh no, we only need it for democracy or for achieve certain goods, we're achieving them, we've been better if we ban hate speech. What do you say?
Well, how do you weigh alternative conceptions of the same idea in any debate? I
Like
mean,
you said you don't before, you said it becomes
well,
neutral.
so you're supposed to say who has better argued for their side. I think there's maybe
So these are the only relevant areas about free speech that you can actually push, like the only relevant choices.
I mean, I think, like I said, I think there's a spectrum between the most instrumental justifications on one hand and the most autonomy maximizing, you need to have lots of ideas surrounding you, even if you're never going to be convinced by them, in order to be able to have the capacity to potentially be influenced by them, on the other hand, right? I'm not sure if these are necessarily the only ones, but these are definitely the major ones. I mean, there might be someone out there who's published a book that has a different conception or different justification of freedom of speech. But I would say, broadly speaking, these are the major ones that say either it's about trying to find truths and get ideas, or it's something that flows from the fact that we're a democracy and it's something that's necessary for democracy, or it's something that is something that's intrinsic and inalienable from the individual, and that you can unpack that in a couple of ways. It might well be the case that it's so intrinsic to the individual and it's so tied into autonomy that the state has an active obligation to facilitate ideas being in the environment of the individual so that they can make a choose from.